各位领导、使节、驻华代表们、女士们、先生们、朋友们，大家早上好！欢迎大家出席由全球化智库和欧洲政策研究中心、欧洲政策中心主办的中欧智库交流，来探讨中欧关系的重要话题。
Distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you, and welcome to EU and China think tank exchanges, co-organized by the European Policy Center and the Center for China and Globalization, with the vision to strengthen consensus and deepen dialogue on issues that matter to both the EU, China, as well as the world.
下面有请全球化智库创始人兼理事长、国务院原参事王辉耀先生主持致辞环节。
Now, to host the opening session, let's warmly welcome Dr. Wang Huiyao, President of the Center for China and Globalization and former counselor to the State Council. Let's welcome.
Ambassador Wu, Ambassador Toledo, and President Zuleeg. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, and of course we have scholars, people from academic, business, and diplomatic corps here in Beijing, and also some media friends. So this is really a great privilege for me to introduce our forum again today, because we had a very successful 8th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum yesterday. And we're very pleased today to gather again, and Center for China and Globalization, and of course also European Policy Center is jointly organized this EU-China think tank exchange dialogues and roundtables. So we are very pleased to welcome all of you here today. And so we have actually seen the China-EU relations has been evolving for the last number of years, and recently we see quite a few high-level visits. Joseph Borrell just visited China not too long ago, and we know Ambassador Toledo is very active promoting China-EU relations. I'm very pleased to report that just last month, actually, Center for China and Globalization held its 9th annual forum in Beijing. And at our opening panel, we had China, US, and EU climate dialogue. And Ambassador Toledo was a keynote speaker, and of course, Ambassador Nick Burns, and also Chinese envoy for environment, for climate change. Minister Xie Zhenghua was there, and also Chinese also former Foreign Minister, Deputy Foreign Minister Liu Zhenyun. So we had an extremely good discussion, and also many ambassadors who presented here was on that part of discussion. We also had the China-EU dialogue. A second roundtable that day is about China-EU dialogue. It's about 20 European ambassadors participated. So CCG is really dedicated to promoting this China-EU relations. And also I'm pleased to report that for the European Policy Center, we'll be extremely productive. And even during the pandemic, we have jointly worked with the European Policy Center and other partner think tanks to work on this EU-China think tank exchange program that's funded by EU. And for that purpose, CCG has worked with EPC, and we have paid several visits, even during the pandemic, to the Brussels. Personally, I went there 3 times to meet our EPC colleagues and then to really engage this project. And of course, also we had to produce the 4 reports and 7 webinars and events in the course of 2 to 3 years. So today is really a major event that highlighted our past research and exchanges. So I'm very thankful to our partner EPC, of my friend President Fabian, Zuleeg. So he's always very participating, very supportive, and his team also worked very hard. So I want to thank them for that. But today, to open this important panel, I would really like to invite two most distinguished guests and also very important top experts on China-EU relation or EU-China relation. And first, I would like to also introduce Ambassador Toledo. He's a seasoned diplomat and has been positioned has been worked, of course, many years in the diplomatic career, and outstanding diplomat, and also he was ambassador to Japan, and before posted in Beijing. And since he's in Beijing, he has visited CCG, has attended many CCG events, has been instrumental in securing China-EU relations. And he, of course, he worked at the span for the EU many years for European policy issues. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ambassador Toledo to give his opening keynote, and let's welcome Ambassador Toledo, please.
Ni hao. Dear Henry, dear Mabel, dear friends of the China Center for Globalization, a think tank, an organization which is always so helpful to facilitate exchanges between the EU and China. Dear Ambassador Wu, dear colleagues from the EU, I can see some of them there, and dear participants, especially, dear participants in the EU-China think tank exchange. It is really a pleasure to speak at the opening of this conference, first of its kind since the lifting of COVID restrictions in January last year, and first of its kind in the last 4 years. 3 years of pandemic measures left a significant, extremely negative impact on people-to-people exchanges between Europe and China, between China and the rest of the world, in fact, including this kind of person interactions between researchers of both sides. Today's conference is fortunately a step in the right direction. It coincides with the steady resumption of in-person, high-level dialogues and political meetings between the EU and China, between China and the rest of the world. Just 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, High Representative Vice President Borges visited China and co-chaired with Foreign Minister Wang the 12th EU-China Strategic Dialogue. Let me make a few remarks on the importance of the EU-China think tank exchanges, which we are determined to promote, to take them back to the level they had before the pandemic, and even to a higher level. Because think tanks are one of the most powerful engines of knowledge, innovation, and policy formulation. And this both, I must say, both in the European Union and in China. I have personally witnessed how important think tanks are in China for policy formulation. You provide valuable insights, research, and recommendations that shape the decisions of governments, businesses, and civil society. And you are civil society, so you feed your civil society. You are the representative of civil society, which feed policy formulation for governments. You also serve as bridges between academia, policymakers, and the public, and you facilitate a deeper understanding of complex issues and the development of well-informed policies. The EU and China face a multitude of global challenges, such as climate change, security issues, conflicts and wars, like Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but also, unfortunately, the very recent war in the Middle East. Again, we are also facing an imbalanced economic relation with China, the EU and China, especially when it comes to trade. These challenges, as difficult as they are, demand cooperative solutions, fostering exchanges between think tanks from the EU and China, in this sense, can be extremely useful as a platform for effective collaboration. Because think tanks promote mutual understanding. While the EU and China have different political systems, different economic models, and different cultural backgrounds, it is important to recognize the areas where our interests, even sometimes our values, converge. These intersections exist, and by facilitating dialogue, we can identify common ground, share experiences, and build trust. Secondly, think tanks exchanges provide an opportunity for robust, evidence-based discussions. They pool resources, expertise, and data, so think tanks from both sides can conduct joint research and analysis that is objective and impartial. These collaborative research can help address global issues like climate change, again, sustainable development, public health, ensuring that the best available knowledge is at the heart of policymaking. Furthermore, think tank exchanges can lead to innovative solutions. Our world is changing rapidly, and traditional models and approaches often fall short. By bringing together experts from the EU and China, we can generate fresh ideas and unconventional solutions, out-of-the-box solutions to tackle today's challenges. These new ideas can redefine the boundaries of cooperation and innovation, enabling us to create a better future together. But, there is always a but. It is essential to approach these exchanges with openness and transparency. I have to note with regret that some of the recent development in China run counter to the benefits I just described of free and open exchanges between civil society and between think tanks. And I'm talking, for instance, of the difficulties we are encountering for foreign experts, for European experts, to research in China, something that has become more difficult recently, that is encountering with more bureaucratic obstacles for these exchanges. And I'm also talking about the national security inspired legislation, like the recent counter-espionage law, or the extremely rigid requirements for data transfer, which we are trying to make more flexible in our exchanges with the Chinese government. But let me turn briefly to the EU-China relations as we see it now and for 2024. As I already said, the High Representative Vice President had held 10 days ago with Director Foreign Minister Wang his strategic dialogue. First time in person in his tenure as High Representative. This followed some other important exchanges between the EU and China. And it was one of the high-level dialogues that we held this year. We also held in July the high-level dialogue on climate and environment with Executive Vice President Timmermans, the high-level dialogue, the high-level digital dialogue with Vice President Jourova at the beginning of September, and the high-level economic and trade dialogue with Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. 4 Vice Presidents of the Commission have visited China in the last 3 months, plus 2 commissioners, and these exchanges, these in-person exchanges, were inaugurated by President of the European Council, Charles Michel, on the 1st of December, even before the pandemic restrictions were lifted, and were followed by President of the Commission, von der Leyen, in April. So we are re-engaging with China, and this is good. We have our differences. They have not gone, we have not narrowed the difference we have yet, but at least we are engaging, and we are engaging much more frequently. As High Representative Vice President repeatedly told his Chinese interlocutors, China and the EU are partners, competitors, and also systemic rivals. Chinese interlocutors always tell us and told Vice President Borrell and all our visitors from the Commission here that they don't like the word systemic rivals. But unfortunately, we are indeed also rivals. We are partners, we are competitors, but we are also systemic rivals because we have different systems. But as I'm saying recently, this is a description. This is not a strategy. A description of the facts that we are partners, that we are competitors, and that we are rivals. We are rivals because our values and benefits are different on many subjects, including democracy, the universal character of human rights. This way in which we as Europeans view our relationship with China will probably not change in 2024. But we are systemic rivals, we are competitors, and we are partners. We are partners in very important issues that we have to solve together. And our partnership in climate, in fight against climate change, in the protection of biodiversity, in the protection of the environment, is going rather well, I must say. We have a very good coordination, we have a very good cooperation, and there are other global issues in which we can partner, in which we are partners. One of them, for instance, is global health, but other even international issues that are conflictual issues where we can partner. We are competitors, especially when it comes to trade and when it comes to investment. We are trying to get to a more level playing field, because we feel that there is no level playing field. We reached the highest trade deficit in the history last year, and we believe that this is not only because China, we recognize, makes very good products at very good prices, but because we find market access barriers that we have to solve to get to a level playing field. But what we hope is that China understands that being rivals on values and systems does not mean that we are enemies. We want China to understand that the European Union is not afraid of China's rise, nor does it want to stand on its way. On the contrary, we would like China to become more involved in collective efforts to tackle global issues with us, and we are doing that. Like climate change, I said, but also on important issues like restructuring the debt of developing countries. The future of EU-China relations in 2024 is marked by a complex interplay of economic interdependence, where we will press ahead seeking, as I said, a more balanced relation, seeking to cooperate on global challenges, and certainly on security issues like the war of aggression on Ukraine waged by Russia. In this sense, let me stress, as I always do with my Chinese interlocutors, that China's position, China's reputation, China's image in Europe is being extremely negatively affected by its position on this war of aggression, which is not called, you can read the newspaper, never called in China, never called in China war of aggression. Not even the words we use are the same. In any case, the relationship between the EU and China is essential not only for our own prosperity, but also for the stability and progress of our interconnected world. So, to sum up, I wish you a fruitful discussion for the first time in 4 years in person. This is essential for us policy makers, policy implementers, that we need you to meet in person, to develop relationship, and to feed us with the results of your research and the results of your collaboration. Let me end by expressing sincere thanks to Fabian and his team in EPC, to Henry and his team at CCG for making today's event possible. Thank you very much. 谢谢.
Thanks, Your Excellency, Ambassador Toledo, for your very comprehensive and also stimulating discussion. And I think I can agree with you that think tank should really be playing more important roles in terms of facilitate dialogue and enhance understanding and also improve the cooperation. So this is extremely important. That's why EPC and CCG that we are engaging on this project for the last 3 years. I also would like to say that through the dialogue, we felt there was more area to cooperate. You know, like we had yesterday, we have Joseph Nye, a Harvard professor, mentioned about, you know, we have competition, but also we have a cooperation. And Graham Allison actually also invited to our CCG roundtable at the Munich Security Conference, and he was saying, we've been talking too many competition and less about cooperation, and we should at least talk about same amount of cooperation competition. So thank you, Ambassador Toledo. I know I forgot to mention Ambassador Toledo was a seasoned diplomat. He was actually the secretary of the SPAM for European and Spanish European and EU affairs for a number of years, and of course he was ambassador to India and Japan. So now he's in China for the EU. So this is a good position. Now I'd like to really strongly recommend our next speaker, our keynote opening speaker, which is Ambassador Wu Hailong. He actually is a very seasoned diplomat. He had joined the Minister of Foreign Affairs a long time ago. He even actually he was in a multilateral position. He was in Hong Kong as a deputy special envoy there, and then he was the also envoy to the United Nations in Vienna and other international organizations, and of course he was the ambassador to UN and United Nations Atomic Energy Agency as well. He was Director General of International Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also he was Assistant Deputy Minister of Minister of Foreign Affairs, and of course, most important reason, he was also served as ambassador to EU in Brussels and ambassador to Geneva, and also as the president of China Institute of People's Diplomacy, and now he's the president of China Association for Public Diplomacy. So Ambassador will have so many titles, but I think he's a key person that understands European affairs and is being European, posted many times, and really knowledgeable. And we're very fortunate to get him to our conference to share his views and to have his opinions about China-EU relation. Let's welcome Ambassador Wu.
各位来宾，
Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is my first time at a meeting organized by CCG. The reason I am a participant today is that I am very interested by the topic we discussed today. In recent years, I am not officially engaged in China-EU affairs, but I still pay a lot of personal interest and attention to the developments. It is something that's very close to my heart. I think that there is a significant difference between China and the EU. China looks more on the bright side, whereas the EU looks more on the negative side of our China-EU relations. Just now, Ambassador Toledo gave his intervention, and in his speech we could see that. And I think that we should give more focus to the positive side. Basically, his narrative follows Mr. Borrell's speech made at Peking University. So my talk today will also be focusing on some of the words or expressions by Ambassador Borrell in his speech made at Peking University. He said that, I quote, we need to work with China just as China needs to work with us. the world today is heavily interdependent. It's full of conflict, and that's why we need cooperation even more. China has, I think that China has always been very positive in promoting China-EU relations for more than for decades. China has treated the EU as a comprehensive strategic partner. China also believes that EU is an important force to be reckoned with in building a multipolar world. China firmly supports the diversification and of the EU. China has made it clear that there is no fundamental conflict of interest between China and the EU. Agreement is outweighs conflict, and cooperation outweighs competition. Foreign Minister Wang said not long ago at the high-level meeting between China and EU, made that point again. China is not just something that China says, it is also something that China does. Some dozens of years ago, when China was facing a debt crisis, I was China's ambassador to the EU. China lent a hand during the financial crisis. When we were fighting COVID-19, when there was a severe shortage of materials, the China-EU train sends non-stop these essential materials from China to Europe. China has helped European countries build ports, railways, bridges, and highway, addressing issues that local population had been dreaming of addressing for generations. Some might argue that China did this because of geopolitical reasons, and some even said that argued that China wanted to fragment Europe. But this is hardly the truth, because there is no geopolitical conflict or fundamental conflict of interest between China and the EU. China has never thought of influencing the EU. China never exported its own values to EU, so there is no ground for such an argument. China's cooperation with many European countries, cooperation mechanisms, were built on a voluntary basis and focusing on cooperation and mutual benefit. They are open and transparent. The dozens of years have shown that China has never sought to fragment or split EU. Has China ever sought to distance some countries from the EU? Or I think that there's none such case. China has also never released any negative documents or policies against European countries, but there is striking difference in that regard. In the past few years, there has been a major shift in EU's policy towards China, whether it is a policy document of the EU or the China strategy released by member states like Germany and France. They focus more on the part of our relationship as rivals, of the priority of de-risking, the definition of friend, competitor, and systemic rival. The EU has repeatedly tried to explain to us these three-tiered definition. this definition has, you, Your Excellency, has also mentioned in your speech, but I think that it is not convincing, and we can hardly accept that. High Representative's speech at Peking University once again explained that, because he explained that China holds a fundamentally different views and opinions on human rights issues. Ambassador Toledo also touched on that. He said that on this point, the two sides are rivals, and the fundamental reason is the incompatibility in our value systems. I think that this makes little sense, because on the issue of human rights, there has always been differences between China and the EU, and it's hardly something new. And China and the EU had always kept in touch on issues of human rights. So why now? Why treating China as a systemic rival now? I was DG of International Affairs at the Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. Each year we hold 2 human rights dialogues with the EU. I led a Chinese delegation 10 times, and my feeling was that the dialogues were fruitful and constructive, and I was more than willing to hold these dialogues with the EU. On the issue of human rights, I said that this explanation, this reason is not really convincing. Differences in values, these are also hardly convincing. There are 24 words or terms in China's core socialist values: prosperity, democracy, civilization, harmony, freedom, equality, equity, justice, patriotism, and respect of work, honesty and friendliness. These are the core socialist values of China. I think that these terms are all acceptable to the EU, and there's hardly anything that you might object to. There's not something that is incompatible with the EU's values. As for China's political system, this system was confirmed or established since the founding of the People's Republic, and the European countries have all acknowledged that.
A few years ago, when I was ambassador to the EU, I heard the European people saying that China-EU cooperation is a great example of cooperation among different countries with different systems. So why can we become rivals today? Mr. Greeley, during his speech at Peking University, said that there are conflicts and there are interdependence, and I don't think that is accurate. Yes, China and the EU have disputes. However, yes, sometimes the disputes are serious. However, I don't think they are disputes. They are conflicts. If we do have conflicts, can we really depend on each other anymore? So that is self-conflicting. It is not logic. That is not a logical thinking or saying. Mr. Borges, in his speech, complained about the imbalanced China-EU trade, and he said that this imbalance is aggravating, and he attributed it to the difficulties suffered from the European investors in the Chinese market. He said that EU's investment in China declined a lot, reaching the lowest level since 2018. And now we can find no new European investors in China anymore. I think the deficit of our trade comes from different reasons. It's not just about the difficulty experienced by European investors in China. The EU can sell a lot of products to China, and China wants it, especially the high-tech products. But does the EU really want to sell it to China? China wants a lot of European investment, but the EU has established a lot of obstacles, especially the foreign investment review mechanism against China. So that has closed the door for the Chinese investors. China's investment in the EU has thereby declining so seriously. And Mr. Borges said that the EU investment in China is declining and there are no new European investors. I think that is because the European companies are not optimistic about investment in China. So they are waiting and see. I think that is closely related to the negative policy of the EU against China, and the EU said that they want de-risking and they want to put security above economic interests. So does anybody really dare to make any investment in China anymore in that context? So now we're facing challenges between us. So I don't think it is right for the EU to blame everything on China. We also need to find reasons in ourselves. If the EU pursues a proactive and friendly dialogue policy with China and they can approve the China-EU investment treaty, I believe a lot of EU business people will come to China and a lot of the trade issues will be settled as a result. About de-risking, Mr. Borrelli, in his speech, made a lot of explanations. He said that it is for protecting the EU's economy. It's not out of political considerations. It is not hostility against China. He said that China has also made similar points. But actually, all of us are very clear about this. Any country or any company, when they do business or make investment, they need to have the awareness of risk prevention. That is just a common sense. However, if we just use de-risking as a policy, when we deal with a country or we use it to target at a particular country, it is no longer a common sense business issue. It has become a political issue. It is a kind of policy against a country that is unfriendly at all. That will prevent our bilateral cooperation. The Chinese government has never said anything about de-risking against the EU, and China will never do that. And Mr. Borrelli, in his speech, also said that China is ambiguous in its position on the Ukrainian war. And China refused to make a choice between aggression and victims, such terms, and that is unwelcome in the EU. And on the Ukrainian war, China has its clear position and China has its clear understanding of the root of this conflict. And the EU should not impose its position on China, and even less should it use double standards. The U.S. has done so many things against the UN Charter and has done a lot of things about aggression against other people. Has the EU ever blamed the U.S. for that? And the EU has chosen to remain silent on many international affairs. That is not rare at all. So, on the Ukrainian conflict, China knows what it should do, and other countries do not need to teach China how to do it. And Mr. Boruri also expressed EU's position on China, and the key is that it doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country. Taiwan is at the heart of our relations. It is also a very sensitive issue between China and the EU. However, in recent years, some of the EU countries have just crossed over this red line of China by developing official relations with Taiwan and upgrade its level of engagement with Taiwan officially. That is bad for China's sovereignty. That is also interference in China's internal affairs. It is unacceptable to China, and China must make a warning to others, and we will have to react to it. But the European countries say that China is doing it out of coercion or deterrence. That is totally wrong. If anybody harms the core interests of any European countries, will you refrain from issuing a warning or react to it? And if we say that you are doing it out of coercion or pressurizing, will you accept it? I hope that the EU, when dealing with China, should learn to think in the shoes of others. I appreciate Mr. Borges' speech about the need to build trust between China and the EU. It originates from the people-to-people exchanges. We have the complicated international situation, the COVID-19, and the changing relations between China and the EU. The mutual understanding between the two sides has been undermined. So we need to try our best to overcome all kinds of difficulties and carry out all levels of dialogue and exchanges in all areas, especially people-to-people exchanges. But now I think that on the EU side, they do not have such a strong desire to exchange with us, and they are not so active in doing so. Just now, Ambassador Toledo talked about the difficulties we have experienced in our communication and some of the bureaucracy we have suffered from. I can give you an example. Last Wednesday, I called the French embassy in China. I saw the presence of a French consular here, and I made a call to them. I want to meet with the French ambassador. I want to talk to him. But the operator said that you must send an email to me. You tell me who you are and why you want to meet our ambassador. I don't know whether my assistant has sent the email to it, but by now I have not received any reply from the French embassy. So it's already been 5 or 6 days. So probably those experiences can be encountered with Chinese agencies, but that is also true with European agencies too. So anyway, communication will bring us closer, will narrow our differences, and increase our mutual understanding and trust. I have been quite blunt and direct and candid, but I have full confidence in the outlook and prospect of the China-EU relationship. When we just talk about China and the EU, we do not have any big conflicts or conflicts of interests. We can do well in shelving differences and seeking common ground, depend on each other, and work for win-win results. My organization will be fully committed to promoting the people-to-people friendly ties between China and the EU. This year, I took a delegation to Greece, Romania, and Poland in Europe. Next month, the China Public Diplomacy Association will also take a delegation to some European countries for exchanges. We are fully confident in the future of China-EU relations. I hope, finally, this event will be productive with more common ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Wu, for your very comprehensive, of course, very frank, and also a very hopeful discussion. I especially agree with you. I mean, particularly on this comprehensive agreement on an investment treaty that China-EU agreed about 2-3 years ago, and it's very unfortunate that we didn't see that happen. But that is really, I think, the business community from both Europe and China can really cooperate a lot. So I'm also, as Ambassador Wu, very hopeful that through our think tank dialogue, we can maximize our common ground and minimize our differences and find a framework and recommendation to continue to promote China-EU relation and China-European relation. Of course, being the two largest civilizations, and as Ambassador Wu said, we have no geopolitical conflict, and we are very really hopeful that this relation will be continue ever strong. So thank you again, Ambassador Wu. And now I think we are going to have President Zuleeg will host the roundtable, but from the European Policy Center, I don't know if we need a break for before doing that, but let's have probably 5 minutes break, and then we'll continue with our roundtable, even though a little bit delayed, but hopefully we'll have a very exciting roundtable. Okay, yeah, you can say that.
Before the break, we invite our speakers for session 1 and session 2 for a group photo, please. Good morning, everyone. Now we start the first session of today's EU and China think tank exchanges, a look ahead EU-China relations in 2024.
下面我们将开始今天的第一场主题讨论：中欧关系回顾与展望。
Let's invite our moderator, Associate Director and Head of the Europe in the World Program at the European Policy Center, Mr. Ricardo Borges de Castro.
主持本场讨论的是欧洲政策中心副主任兼中心世界中的欧洲项目主管理查德·卡斯特罗先生，有请。
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back again from the short coffee break. I think we had a very good start, and I think we will also continue with a good discussion now at this session. So for those that don't know me, as it was just said, my name is Ricardo Borges de Castro. I'm an Associate Director, and I lead the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Center. So also on behalf of the EPC, I would also like to welcome you all. I want to thank naturally the CCG, Henry and Anne and Mabel, all the team for hosting us. And of course, it's very important that the EU allow us to have and supports us to have this dialogue. So also thank you to the EU delegation here, but also back in Brussels. If you allow me a personal note, this is the last time I was in China was in 2013, so 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, for the 16th EU-China summit, accompanying President Barroso and President Van Rompuy. So it's really delightful for me to be here today to join you in this discussion. The session's title is A Look Ahead, EU-China Relations in 2024. But as I've grown accustomed to these EU-China think tank exchanges, we might look ahead, but there are many and very diverse views. And that's what I hope that we are able to do today, is actually look ahead to EU-China relations, but also have the diversity and the plurality of views that are important in these discussions. We have 6 speakers. I was not very prescriptive precisely to allow them to look ahead and share their views on how they see the EU-China relations moving forward, and particularly also next year. So I will give the floor to the speakers. I will start with a European colleague, then I'll call on a Chinese colleague. And then I will open the floor to the table, also to the floor back there. We want an inclusive and participatory discussion. We have about 90 minutes to discuss and to present. And so without further ado, I would call on Fabian Zuleeg for his first remarks. I would call all the speakers to do 5-6 minutes introductory remarks so that we can have an opportunity for a good discussion. Fabian, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you also from my perspective to CCG and to Henry in particular. We've had many activities online, but it is very nice to be able to do this in person again. So very happy to have this discussion. These are challenging times. I think we've already heard some of that in the opening remarks. And in that context, it's even more important to have open and frank exchanges and to enhance mutual understanding. And my thanks again to CCG, but also to Egmont and CIS and all the think tanks who are participating in these exchanges. And I also want to thank the EU delegation for the funding provided and the support they have given us. I also want to thank the ambassadors for their very frank opening statements. I think it's a very useful start for this debate. And in the context of open exchanges, I also want to note that it is disappointing that Miku Huotari, who's senior advisor with EPC and head of MERICS, didn't receive a visa to participate. We think it's important that all think tanks can be able to have these exchanges, and we hope that is possible in future. Turning to EU-China relations, this is a difficult moment, especially since Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And for many, China's perceived political support for Russia is a major issue, but we also see that the frictions between China and the US are spilling over into the EU-China relationship. I want to emphasize that there are many areas where the EU and the US diverge, but when it comes to Ukraine, I want to make it very clear that from my perspective, this is not coercion by the US, but this is a direct security threat to the European Union, and I think there's a very broad consensus that we have to support Ukraine to resist and to preserve its territorial integrity in line with international law. I want to look a bit into the areas of competition and cooperation following on from the discussion we had yesterday. I'll try to keep it brief, but I think there are a number of areas of discussion, and I want to start with what has been named Europe's strategic autonomy, or in some iterations now, economic security. I want to start by saying this is an old concept. This is not something which has only been on the agenda very recently. Energy security, for example, has been around for a long time. I would also want to emphasize that this is not something which only relates to China. Certainly the move towards strategic autonomy was driven also by Trump. And certainly the concerns around Russia and dependence on Russian gas have been around for a long time. There are a number of new measures which are being considered in that context, from anti-coercion to better managing supply chains to investment screening. and a number of other issues we could talk about. But from my perspective, I think it has to be clear that these are not protectionist mechanisms. These are not part of a protectionist agenda, but these are about addressing Europe's vulnerabilities in a world of weaponized interdependence. And I think that is the context in which I would see those measures. Clearly, these will distort competition. I think it is inevitable. But in many ways, I would say the European Union is doing in those areas what many countries have been doing for a very long time. So these are not necessarily very radically different. We also have a number of measures being put into place to manage the transformations, the transitions which are necessary. The transition towards sustainability and climate action. Again, these are controversial because they are going to distort the free exchange. Certainly the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, has been mentioned as an issue not only in the relationship with China, but with many countries. Industrial policy measures which have been taken to drive these transformations. But again, these, in my view, are not aimed at protectionism. They're aimed at achieving the global transformations we need. And in those areas, I think there is also scope for global cooperation and global governance. A further area which was also mentioned is fair competition. And this is a different issue than the security issue. I think it is a discussion about how fair the competition is between China and the EU. And I would see the investigations which are there around electric vehicles, the discussions around steel in that context. So there I would very much emphasize that these are investigations. We will see what evidence there is for distortions to competition. But in this context, I would emphasize that it is actually, in my view, a benefit not only to the European Union, but also to our trading partners to have these measures at the European level. Because if we have measures at the European level, we have to have a common legal framework which is commonly enforceable, which is transparent, and which has to be based on evidence, given that it is challengeable also in the courts of law. So I think this is actually a benefit rather than a difficulty. All of that raises the question of how do we cooperate in this context on global challenges, and it was emphasized also yesterday, but I want to emphasize it again, that clearly we all collectively have to deal with the major global challenge of climate change. It is not an option, but it is a necessity for the continuation of humanity, and in that context we have to find ways of overcoming the difficulties and dealing with the trade-offs, the transition costs, and the distributional consequences of the actions which need to be taken. I think it's very important to think about how we can align incentives, in particular for companies, to make sure that we're driving that transition. So what does all that mean for EU-China relations? I think in the economic field we will see a continuing discussion around fair competition. We will also have opportunities for cooperation, especially with regard to the global challenges. I think the one area where we can think whether it is possible to make significant progress is on common global governance, on the multilateral system, which is under pressure, so this is very much a challenge. But I think what is very important is that we continue to have an open dialogue, that we continue to foster mutual understanding. So I'm very happy to be here and to have this discussion with think tank colleagues from China and from the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabian. I believe that everybody knows who Fabian is, but I should have introduced you. He's the Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the European Policy Center. I would like now to give the floor to Kui-Yong Zhang. He's professor at Academy of Regional and Global Governance at Beijing Foreign Studies University. You have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair, and all of the guests. Especially, let me take a few seconds to express a more emotional feeling. Exactly today, even it's not so easy, especially after some difficult time for person face-to-face communication. So it's my great pleasure here to meet with some old friends again, Fabian, Islam, Shada, and some other. So I think it gives, I mean, a strong confidence for me that no matter what happens for the global situation, for regional situation, and for China-EU relations, I think I still believe strongly that this communication between think tanks, people-to-people contact, always the most valuable thing we needed to do. Because if we look at back or ahead, people mentioned that today is a crossroad for China-EU relations. And to some degree, it reflects the reality. If we look at what happened for this keynote speech, both ambassadors, they do have a very, very clear and candid, understanding and attitude towards these bilateral relations. So I think that that's also give more space or more reasons for think tanks, for peoples to find out more reason for us to have more communication and to, deal with the situation. And I want to just have some points. If we look, we take some more consideration on history or yesterday and tomorrow of China-EU relations. I think firstly we need to understand maybe two approaches. One of them is we need to go inside of these relations to understand what's the change took place in the past years, and also we need to understand the logic behind some policies or some regulations from both two sides. And then we need to go beyond this situation, realities. We need to look for some more reliable solutions for these relations, especially when it is on the crossroads. I think firstly, we can find out disagreement between two sides now on this firstly multifaceted description or concept from European Union side on China. I think always from Chinese side, the question is, once it is established in concept, I mean partner, competitor, and rival, it would be pragmatic or practice in policy and or even in actions. I think a very obvious case is how about the CAI, the CAI's fate. As we know, once it is in the logic of partner or even the competitions, I think now we will have this CAI now. But unfortunately, as we know, now it has been frozen in European Parliament. It looks like the European side has been coping with this issue in the logic of rivalries. So I think it gives a very, very big question for both two sides, for policymakers, for scholars. How could we keep the balance of the policy? I think one of the big risks for this, multi-faceted concept from European side on China is very, very, it's easy to reach an imbalance situation between all of the three policy approaches. Another, I think, a very important issue is even China and the European Union, there are more and more, geopolitical, coexistence. Maybe there's a new dimension for these relations, not only in economic trade, not only people to people, and because of Ukrainian crisis or even Israel-Palestine conflict. Both sides need to have some more geopolitical exchange. So China is a natural competitor or even rival with European Union, or China would be a flexible choice for European Union, have some more strategic trust. Also, just like Fabian and also the European Union ambassador here mentioned that the European side not so satisfied with the attitude from China on Ukrainian crisis, and especially its relations with Russia and some other. But I think maybe for China, the most important thing is once there is not the current situation, especially in the relations between China and Russia, maybe the situation will be worse. Maybe Russian side will go far away from the current situation. So how could we try to keep the strategic stability? I think it's not only the consideration for China. It should be also a major consideration for European side. And beyond all of these, difficult issues, I think now we need to try to find some solution going beyond the difficult situation or reality. For example, how could China and the European Union side, if we are wise enough to find out maybe long-term solutions to have some more, crisis management or uncertainty management. Always for China and the European Union side, it looks like recently we are in more and more uncertainties, some more anti-subsidy investigations, and less and less mutual trust on some issues, and mostly from a third part. For example, once there are close relations between China and Russia, there will be some more worry or suspicions from European side. At the same time, once there are some more coordination of policy between Washington and Brussels, there will be also more concern from Beijing. So how could we try to go beyond these twists of the relations? How could we find a more endogenous dynamics from China-EU relations? If we look at the economic trade, yes, it looks like there are some more barriers from both two sides, frankly, on a kind of over-regulations. But how could we try to stop these tendencies? How could we try to convince policymakers from both two sides that once we have some more favorable environment for both China and the European companies and enterprises, there will be more confidence from market from both sides with each other. And finally, I think that not only we need to deal with this influence from a third party, and also we need to try to find out the real pragmatic solutions to manage these relations. Of course, I think we need to make clear the destination for this management of uncertainties between those two sides is to try to find out a more cooperative, not competitive relations. And if we look at the logo of this conference, interesting thing is the logo looks like a boxing glove. So it gives us a message. It looks like both China and the European side, they are going to a boxing field. But of course, we can find that it's also a charter box, which means that we need to have some more communication to avoid we are going to the boxing field. I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kui. I mean, I'm just going to be a moderator, but I do not see. I mean, I'm a boxer, and, or I mean, I amateur, do a little bit of boxing, and those look more as dialogue balloons. So I think that, at least to me, but anyway, it's. I think that. Out now, but thank you very much for your views also on the look ahead and on EU-China relations. If I can now give the floor to Janka Oertel. She's director of the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Janka, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here in Beijing again. Please allow me to also kind of stay within the spirit of the two ambassadors' remarks with regard to the candidness that I would like to engage in. Let me start by reiterating what Fabian has mentioned, that it is very unfortunate that the member of our delegation was not receiving a visa. I think that is not in the spirit of dialogue, and I do think that Mikko Hotari from Merix belongs at this table to have a really good conversation. It is a very unfortunate situation, particularly for us in Berlin, if some of us can and some of us cannot go to have direct face-to-face conversation. I just wanted to point that out at the beginning. On the state of EU-China relations, before we look out, I do think it is really important to be honest about the fact that it is grim. We're not in a state where we can sugarcoat what is happening. And I would even say 2024 is likely to get worse. So for us, I think stopping the deterioration of the relationship must be the key goal at the moment. But that is, I think, the aim, the kind of humble aim that we can have for the next year. Not to talk much about where things can improve, but about stopping the current trajectory. The list of grievances on the European side is long. I do think that it kind of corresponds with the list of grievances on the Chinese side. But obviously, as Fabian has mentioned, market distortions are a huge issue for us at the European side. A level playing field is something that the European side keeps bringing up, but quite frankly, it's not in the interest of China right now, because it is not in China's favor if the level playing field would actually exist. Therefore, I think maybe we have to give up on the idea that it will ever exist again, or that it ever has existed. There are developments within China that are obviously very troubling for the European business community, and I do think it is important to underscore that the main movement in the change of the European relationship with China and the development of the holy trinity of the partner, competitor, and rival started within the German business community. This is not some lofty idea of diplomats or weird think tankers. It was the concern of German industry that has started bringing this concept to the table, and that has kind of put the rivalry at the center and the competition at the center of the relationship. And I do think that this is absolutely key for the relationship with regard to China and Russia, which is, I think, the absolutely central development of the last 2 years in EU-China relations. For Europeans, it increasingly feels that geopolitical turmoil comes at high costs for Europe, not just high energy prices and inflation, but also migration pressures and huge investments in the defense sector, but that these developments are actually beneficial for China. And this puts the trajectory of the relationship at a very complicated outset. For us, it is not about the long term right now, and I do think that this is also important to underscore. This is about a short-term crisis that Europe is facing. Europe has a war at its borders that is challenging it at its very core and at its very heart. And the fact that China-Russia relations over the course of the last 2 years have deepened is obviously a smack in the face for EU-China relations. It is problematic for Europeans to watch a Belt and Road Forum unfold in which President Putin is received with great honors. These pictures are being viewed in Europe on TV and are seen with great disdain, because this is currently the largest challenge to our peace and prosperity in Europe. The pressure on Europe at the moment is enormously high. This is the largest security crisis that we have faced, and now we have the Israel-Gaza crisis on top of things, with the aggressions of Hamas kind of challenging further our security environment and further enhancing migration pressures. Right now, I think the world would really need different signals than a quasi-neutrality that is not neutrality, but that is siding with the aggressors in two conflicts that are of key importance to Europe. So realistically, there's not much of an expectation that we can find common ground right now. I think even on climate change, which is mentioned often, COP28 will have to show how much common ground there can actually be found. For Europe right now, this is a time for de-risking. It is a time for de-risking because the world around us has changed very much not in our favor. In practice, that puts us in three areas in key kind of challenges: the import area, the export area, and market dependencies. On the import front, I think we're making good progress when it comes to critical raw materials and new partnerships, when it comes to diversifying from where goods are from. I do think that the EU is on the right track. On exports, it's going to be more difficult. And the most challenging for the German economy is going to be the market dependence here on the Chinese market. But quite frankly, the current developments within the Chinese economy are helping to reduce that dependency for the German side. Dialogue, and maybe to kind of be clear about that, is important, but not just to achieve dialogue for dialogue's sake and to have a kind of cooperation idea. It is important to manage our competition, but between think tanks, I think I expect more of this form of dialogue. So maybe I will end with a few research questions that I'm actually interested in comparison to all the things that we can throw at each other in terms of list of grievances. I want to know where the Chinese economy is headed, and I would really like to know what Hongjian is thinking about that, and where things are going and where things are moving. I want to know what the concrete room is for cooperation in creating fiscal space and developing countries for the green transition, and what Chinese ideas for that are, where Chinese solutions for that would be, so that we can discuss them and that we can talk about them very concretely. I would also like to discuss whether competition is not actually better for climate change than cooperation. If we actually really compete and race to the top about who's faster in implementing decarbonization and green technologies, maybe that's even better. Let's discuss that. What is the state and the time frame of renminbi internationalization? Where are we on that? And what does this mean for Europe? I would love to discuss more about that. How can we maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, and what role for Europe does China see in that? And what are our respective expectations of 2025 and the post-US election timeframe that I think sends shivers down European diplomats and policymakers' spines when they even think about it. And I do think that a really frank exchange about that with our Chinese counterparts would be helpful. I think having a real conversation about this is very valuable, and this is why I'm here, and I think this is hopefully what we can engage in. Thank you.
Thank you, Janka, for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Sun Yongfu. He's Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. He's also former Director General of MOFCOM at the Department of European Affairs. Sir, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for me to attend today's event. I think such candid dialogue is good for both sides. I would like to say something about our practical cooperation, or specifically business cooperation. I want to talk about three things. First, for the EU till 2019, EU had been the most important trading partner to China for 16 consecutive years, the top trading partner to China. In 2020, it was surpassed by ASEAN because of UK exit from the EU, and the U.S. imposition of tariffs on China, so some of the trade shifted to ASEAN. So now the EU became the second largest trading partner to China, and the ASEAN is the largest. It is fair to say that in the past few years, our business relations have always been the stabilizer and baluster for our relations in all other areas. But now the situation is really worrying. Just now, our colleagues talked about Germany's important role in China-EU ties. In the past, Germany took 1/3 of the total trade between China and the EU, and it is always the most important trading partner in our business ties. We know that Germany has the strongest auto industry, and China is always the top market for the top 3 German automakers. So that is very important for Germany. So to replace this huge market of China is not something good for the European exporters, especially auto exporters. The second thing I want to say is this. China-EU business cooperation has more and more been influenced by our relations, ideologies, and values on human rights, for example. And of course, there are some also negative impacts from China-US relations. And the 2 ambassadors in the opening remarks talked about the positioning or cooperation, competition, and rivalries, systemic rivals. But I feel that there are more and more occasions for Europe to talk about systemic rivals, and less and less they are talking about cooperation. So they are focusing more on conflicts and less on cooperation. That is very bad for our practical cooperation. And third, I want to give you some numbers to show that our practical cooperation between China and the EU is now in a state of great danger. From that is the first 9 months in 2023. According to China's latest number, our trade was $594 billion, down by 7.7%. So according to my experiences over the past 30 years, it is really unprecedented. In the past year, even, the trade grew slightly. It was about $800 billion. It was still growing, but now it was a negative 7.7% in the first 9 months. That is really something I have never seen since I worked as the DG of the European Affairs Department of MOFCOMs. I think this should be a top concern of both sides.
So China's export was 300 billion to EU, down 10%. Import 210 billion, 2.1% down. So you can see that export was sliding much faster than import. So 10.6% export versus 2.1% import. The Chinese surplus of more than 100 billion. It was down 19%. So we have seen that the reduction of China's surplus was more than 20%, which is, I think, more beneficial to the EU side. In terms of investment, from January to September this year, EU investment in China, non-financial, was 921 million US dollars. China's investment to the EU, 509 million. That was 13.8% higher. So in contrast to trade. There is still an increase in investment. In any case, negative growth in trade should be an alert for us. This is not good for both China and the EU. Also, seeing that HED, high-level economic dialogue, has resumed. I think that this will help our bilateral trade. HED reached many outcomes, which is good in addressing some of the EU's exchanges, which bodes well for our future cooperation. China also expressed its readiness to import more EU goods. Cooperation for example, on the Belt and Road Summit, China announced the full opening of its manufacturing sector, which I believe will create more opportunities for European companies. As to my knowledge, there will be a leaders' summit by the end of this year. So my feeling was that highest level contact will help us increase mutual benefit and mutual trust and understanding. De-risking does not mean de-cooperation. So I think we shouldn't talk more about systemic rival, but we should focus more on how to expand cooperation. There are many areas, especially in the area of facing the climate, new energy, energy storage. So I believe that China's high-quality growth and the recovery of the EU's economy would be helpful to both our economies. I believe that as long as we work together, our economy will return to its normal track, but of course it requires some bilateral efforts. Thank you.
On my left, Francoise Nicolas. She's director at the Center for Asian and Indo-Pacific Studies at Institut Français de Relations Internationales. Françoise, tu as la parole. Merci.
Well, thank you, Ricardo. First of all, let me thank the organizers for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be back in Beijing. It's been 4 years since COVID, so I'm quite happy to be here. First thing, I'm afraid I will not disappoint Ambassador Wu, and I will tend to sound rather negative, as Europeans usually are, apparently. You know, I do agree with Janka that if we look at the EU-China relations for 2024, what can be expected is continuation of very tense relation. And I think there's no point in trying to sugarcoat or put on rosy-colored glasses. The situation is not good. Let's face it. And if we exclusively try to look at the bright side of things, we may miss a number of things which are rather negative. So let me highlight perhaps 2 areas where I see major difficulties between the 2 parties. The first is, of course, trade and the persistence of unbalanced trade. On this specific point, let me get things straight right from the start. I am not against unbalanced trade. If the trade is unbalanced between the EU and China, it should not be exclusively blamed on China. If the trade is unbalanced, it may be simply because China is more competitive than the EU. So I'm all in favor of competition. I'm not in favor of managed trade. So I strongly disagree with those who would like to impose balanced trade. This would be like managed trade. And this is not something that is desirable. I think that we should not set the score of the match even before the game starts, which is exactly what managed trade is doing. So that's not the point. But the point is to ensure that the competition can develop freely. So what we are looking for is fair competition, fair trade. And for that, we do not want any distortions. And this is exactly what the EU is trying to do with the anti-subsidy investigation that it has launched recently against Chinese exports of electric vehicles. The point is simply to make sure that there are no distortions. And so the investigation is about checking whether the electric vehicles benefit from illegal subsidization, and whether, on top of that, this subsidization causes or threatens to cause injury, economic injury to EU producers. That's the point, just to make sure that the competition is fair, period. And on this specific point, I think that the Europeans have gone through a former experience, a former episode of a similar nature in the past, and that was all the story and the episode about the solar panels. So we know exactly what it is to be, the other party may gain and what we may lose with subsidies granted to some productions. So it is very unlikely that the investigation will be withdrawn. First of all, because it is at the EC level that it has been put, plus because of this former experience with the solar panels, we will certainly stick to the investigation. So, of course, this will create tensions with China, but I think that it should be very clear what the point of this investigation is, and it's really about ensuring fair competition. It's not about protectionism of any kind. So it should be clear, but I'm not sure that it is well understood on the other side, and this is why I stress this point very forcefully. So that's the first area where I see what potential frictions, tensions, not necessarily conflict. Let's not play on words. These are frictions, simply frictions, not fundamental conflicts. And let me stress one major point here, which is that the EU or the EU-China relation is very different from the China-US relation. The EU perceives China very differently compared to the way the US perceives China. We do not perceive, we the EU I mean, we do not perceive China as an existential threat. And this is very different from the US position. And again, this is something that I think is quite important, that has to be really well understood on the part of China. So we are not into a confrontational approach to China. And on this specific point, I think we differ quite substantially from the US position. The second area where I see a major problem is, of course, the war in Ukraine. Here there is a deep misunderstanding on the part of the EU about China's position. As far as I know, China is all in favor of national sovereignty, of territorial integrity, and in the case of the war in Ukraine, well, there has been a clear violation of international law. There has been a clear breach. And so this is why, on the part of the EU, we do not understand why China is taking the position it is taking, not calling a spade a spade. This is a war. And why is China still adhering to the Russian rhetoric about a special operation, about a provocation on the part of NATO? There has not been any provocation. I mean, in this story, there is an aggressor, which is Russia, and there is a victim, which is Ukraine. It's extremely clear. And so we do not understand why it is not, this vision is not shared by China, which, on the other hand, shares all the values that are encapsulated in the UN Charter. So this is something that sets us apart, but I think it should be discussed more openly, more candidly, so that we better understand what is the other side's position. But honestly, I personally don't quite understand why China is sticking to the position it is sticking to. So this is another major reason why I think that well, EU-China relation in 2024 will remain rather tense or even grim, as Janka said. Well, perhaps if I want to end on a more optimistic note, perhaps not to be criticized for being all the time so negative, well, there is one definite area where there is scope for cooperation, and it is something that is repeated over and over again, and this is climate change. Okay, fine, but on this specific point, I think that a major contribution of this discussion would be perhaps to come up with concrete actions that could be taken to push this cooperation on climate change ahead or forward. Everybody's talking about that, but I think it is very important to go beyond the rhetoric of let's cooperate on climate change to come up with very concrete suggestions of what could be done together between the EU and China on this specific issue. It may have to do with financing, it may have to do with I don't know what, but let's come up with concrete proposals about what can be done together. Because just saying, well, climate change is an ideal area for cooperation, this is very nice, but let's walk the talk and give concrete suggestions. So I'll end up here on a more positive note.
Yeah, merci, Francoise. Thank you for your remarks. And now, last but not least, I would like to call on Mr. Dai Changzheng. He's the Dean of the School of International Relations at the University of International Business and Economics. Sir, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I should first express my thanks to President Wang Huiyao who invited me to join in such a big event, and thank you, moderator. Frankly speaking, that we are now facing a, increasingly fragmented world, splitting international order. Okay. And you see that two worlds are just happening, going on, and the frictions and the economic and political competition between China and the US is becoming more serious now. We are really facing a world that never seen since 20 years. So, both China and EU are most important civilizations and most critical players in regarding international political relations. I think that there are more difficulties and problem emerging towards the Sino-US, Sino-European relations, no doubt. Okay. But the most important is that we should look into things why those situations happen. I'm a scholar of political science and international relations. However, first of all, if we see the ongoing situation of Sino-Europe relations, we may find that the policy contradictions, controversial concepts and policies issued by EU. Actually, this is, from my perspective, this is the main, reason why we feel confused with the policy of EU toward China. For me, the three aspects of strategies toward China, the concepts itself, actually is very controversial. How we can balance rival, competitor, partner. And what are the relationships between these three too? And in some aspect, EU needs China to be part of the in economic and trade realm. EU wants China to be kind of competitor. And in terms of security, in terms of political problems, EU look China as the rival. How do we understand such a controversial, contradictory, concepts and policies? How can we divide such three concepts? Are they, a level and a sub-level, general and sub-level? This is for the scholars, for common people. We do not understand how EU stand on its points. So we may find many, contradictory actions and practices, policy practices. For example, China and EU now both are facing serious challenges economically. We need cooperation. We need to understand each other's interests. However, investigations, anti-subsidy policies, investigation and anti-dumping investigation initiated by EU seriously harm these kinds of relationships. We need to increase trade. However, in terms of semiconductor, green products, and the digital industry, EU just practice the policy of de-risk China. On one hand, EU need to express its stance to communicate with China. On the other hand, practically, EU actually continue or launch this policy of de-risking China. And how can we understand the relationship between so-called dialogue, conversation, and de-risk China? As for, I noticed also the Borges speech in Beijing University. On one hand, Borges says that we never intend to establish the so-called official relationship or diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. However, still EU look at the policy of China toward Taiwan as a so-called coercive action. For the Chinese side, we see that this is obviously an interference with the domestic affair of China. So these policies or the value viewpoints behind this policy themselves are controversial and obscure. It's hard to be understood. And other, political and economic issues. this has created a very hard environment. Many, international corporations headquarters, moved out of China. And more of the industries and businesses are skeptical about the future, about they took a stance, just a look. So both sides feel that we need to converse. We need to begin our dialogue. So in the half a year of 2003, the second half, we see that more European side leaders come to China, and also China has taken proactive actions to initiate more communications and conversations with the European side. However, if we do not change such contradictory policies and viewpoints of values, then we cannot build up our trust. So as Borges also said, we need trust, but mutual trust between EU and China is deteriorating. Of course, we know that EU has its own, difficulties and problems. For example, the pressure from the United States and the political and economic situation in EU itself. So how can we, resolve the contradictories between value rival, governance model rival, economic competitor, and interest partnership, and logically, as a professor and scholar, I cannot find the way of logically, analytical. So, if we look at the future of Sino-EU relations in 2024, perhaps more grimmer than today's situation. Of course, more negotiations, more conversations are still better. We need to take actions. We need to understand each other, because we are two big civilizations, the most important players in today's world. We have power, we have a capacity to change the world. I hope that we begin from both sides. China should recognize that stance, the interest and the hope of EU. And at the same time, EU should understand more about China's stance, China's interest, and China's policies. So that's for my speech. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dai Changzheng. I will now open the floor for questions, remarks. I would invite you to put up your name tag if you want to make a contribution, or if anyone behind the desks would want to make also a question or a comment, please go ahead. Very good. So I will just go to Henry. Henry, you have the floor, and then over there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. Excellent roundtable. Very stimulating discussion we had this morning, and I think it's very important that we had China-EU relation in respect, in focus. I'm not that pessimistic, actually, as Francoise. I think that 2024 maybe we'll have a better relation between China and the EU. I have several reasons for that. First is that, of course, China now has totally opened. So we have so many visitors coming, from US, China. So people will come and see, Chinese economy, Chinese viability, the growth, and then also all the things are still, ongoing and uninterrupted. Not as people thought as badly, because when we were out of China, we heard all the time that China is collapsing, China is dead again, and all those, is full of the news every day. But now you come to see, the resilience, and then the vitality is still there. That's optimism number one. Number two, I will say that the world is really a more dangerous place than every year. We haven't finished this Russian war in Ukraine. And then we have the Middle East, Israel-Palestinian war broke out. That's very, very tragic. And particularly those times, and China and the EU needs to work together. And then, absolutely, we see also in the US, the election year is next year, and then we see some Republican already, hesitate of continue to strongly support the war in Ukraine, and then, that war is going to drag on. And then the only country in the world that has a huge influence on Russia is China now. So, you're right, absolutely. China stands by all those principles of UN, territorial integrity, sovereignty. Mr. Wang said that at the Munich Security Conference about 2 years ago when the war broke out, and also China strongly said, no nuclear war to be fought in Ukraine. If Russia cannot fight for nuclear war, what strength does it have? So, and no bombing of civilians and children. So those strong positions, I think, is very, very important. Of course, China didn't go to 100% of what the US and EU position in condemning Russia, because China wants to keep a channel open to talk to Russians, to influence them, to really make things to work. China is the first country to propose a 12-point position paper on the peace proposal for Ukraine, and China has an envoy for the Russian-Ukraine war that is visiting Ukraine and all other countries related. And Chinese president already phoned Zelensky, and the dialogue is still there. So, and China participated in the Saudi Arabia, the Ukraine-Russian conflict summit there, and now China is starting to play more role on the Palestinian and also Israel war, which is going on right now. China has already set of envoy on that, and so I see the world is in a more dangerous place, and we all need China. And then compare with China and the US and EU, China probably get closer with the EU on many similar views. So we're going to save the world if we are not careful. So absolutely, China is so important, and EU has really absolutely all the reasons to work with China. So I kind of agree with what Ambassador Wu said this morning, because if you define Chinese-EU relation as a systemic rivalry and the risk, I remember another Ambassador Wu, Mr. Wu Hailong, actually said a month ago in my conference, he said, basically you are saying, here's the red lights, here's the yellow lights, here's the green lights, and then nobody knows, the risk the company has no, guts to go ahead because the government, the signal is not clear. So I think some of the problem could be founded on both sides, and EU is not really free of that on its policy. So I think that is really things that we need to really work on. And then I think there's a big issues. Like climate change was a champion of European countries, Paris Accord. China has went along, and China has proposed its concrete plan, and we need to work together. And it's very sad to see that EU has proposed this anti-subsidy on the China clean vehicles, clean energy vehicles, because that's the thing we want to do to really accelerate the speed of fighting climate change. So, and then again, because all the major European automakers are in China, they are developing faster. They are clean vehicles in Chinese market and technology and everything. So this is really complementary. But then if you have really starting this trade war with the European warning that, okay, we're going to take measures, we're going to sanction you or whatever, just like US put 1,300 Chinese companies on the sanction list, individuals together. So European hasn't gone that far, but if Europeans starting that, I think it's going to be very, very, dangerous for the bilateral relation. If China retaliates, I mean, all the European auto market in China will be affected. And then the technology progress, the clean vehicle, going to fighting climate change, will be slowing down. We're going to face an even bigger threat of climate change. I mean, that nobody is calculating on those casualties of climate. So I think we really need to work together and refrain from starting a trade war or trade sanctions and whatever. So this is really what I would like to emphasize. Finally, I would like to say, I mean, this April, past April, we were in Berlin. We were attending this Global Solution Summit, and Richard Walker from DW, he's here. He was interviewing the German Chancellor, Scholz, and Scholz said, the unipolar war is gone. We are getting into multipolar war. So, the German government recognized that. French president said we should be more strategically independent. He was in China. So, I mean, I think we should see a difference between China, EU, and US. We should not really, follow all the, on that part. I really, I also want to talk to the, calling that China-West dialogue, because West has quite a few narratives. US has a narrative, EU has a narrative. We see the converge of US and EU narrative, but we really want to see the difference. So it's really like I'm not saying three kingdoms of romance, but three, different views, but China and EU have a lot of things in common. And we even have now the US even have so much difference. We have the majority leader of Senate House Schumer visit China, very successful. And CCG has just recently hosted a delegation from a young assistant to the congressmen and senators. So we hope to have more European parliamentary people coming to China. And we can talk about all the cooperation on the digital, on the climate, on the all those things. So I think there's a lot of things in common. We could work together. I'm still, quite, and also student exchanges, and tourism is reviving. I'm sure there will be a lot of tourism going to Europe rather than go to US. I see the flights resume very fast between China and the EU, faster than the US. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not that pessimistic. Also, next year, the US is facing election, so I think we have but maybe a bit tough time ahead. But I'm seeing the summit of APEC in San Francisco in November. President Xi and President Biden might meet there, and we can probably also reach another level of understanding. So after all, we have to really work together. We are fighting a common threat. I mean, we've gone through this. We have to avoid the conflict. All the EU, US, China, we have to work together to save the world, to save the war. Further deteriorating from Russian on Ukraine and, this Israeli and Palestinian conflict as well. So I really hope that the dialogue we're having today with China EU think tanks can come up with some, common productive proposals that we can really submit to our different governments and make things. I'm glad to see. I'm really thankful for EPC now with the think tank delegation starting to visit China now. This is probably the biggest think tank delegation we ever hosted after the post-pandemic. I mean, we already host the U.S. congressman, senators, Congress assistant. We still wait to see more from Europe. So I'm sure this dialogue, roundtable we have here, will stimulate this kind of a constructive, productive climate, and I'm cautiously hopeful that we'll find the solutions to the common challenge we face in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for your remarks. So the organizers tell me that I can go until 12:45. So I'd encourage everyone to be very quick in their remarks, because I'd also would like still to give the floor to the speakers for 1 minute each before we end, if they wish to still react to any of the comments that were made. But I'll go by order that I've seen the name tags going up. Ma'am, you have the floor. And I think ma'am needs a microphone. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, to CCG and President Henry Wang to have invited me, and Mr. President of the meeting to give me the floor. I have followed the discussion this morning with great interest, but that reminded me of the background of China-EU relationship. If we all recall, the EU-China strategic agenda for cooperation adopted in 2013, and that called for cooperation in area of peace, prosperity, sustainable development, and people-to-people exchanges. From there on, we are witnessing the EU-China summit, which is being held every year to discuss political and economic relations, as well as global and regional issues, and so on. However, the recent development, which I can summarize in 3 categories, have caused some friction. One is geopolitical turmoil, as we have heard this morning in extenso. The second one, of course, is spilling over of the US strategic approach to Europe. And the third one is trade imbalances. But let's talk more about the common ground between China and the world. I'm not only referring to Belt and Road Initiative, I'm sorry, but I'm referring to the regional and international organization in which China actively participated in various areas, including United Nations, WTO, WHO, and etc. China is also have been engaged very actively as a second largest economy in the world and has been a major player in global trade. We have seen China's active participation in 2014 and 2015, particularly in discussion with regard to climate change. And it was, I recall very vividly, China and the United States, they were the 2 frontier and champion for discussing the issues on climate change. And everybody became very hopeful that something very productive will come out of it. China has been also engaged in peacekeeping operation in various international security issues. But of course, China has got its own principle, and this principle, understood or misunderstood by the world, has to be also respected. I do believe in the light of what China has done, the world also has the responsibility to come together with Chinese principle and try to find a common ground in light of what China can do, and because what we need in this world is rather more cooperation than less. The world is going through a very important crisis, not only this year but next year, and further cooperation between these two powers can solve most of the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your remarks. Shada Islam, please have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. So Shada Islam, I'm Senior Advisor at EPC and Visiting Professor at the College of Europe. 4 points, Ricardo, I'm going to be very brief. So first of all, a little bit of historical context, and it's true, I was a journalist when China joined the WTO in 2001. I followed it blow by blow, and it was a momentous moment. So my relationship with China goes back quite a few years. I've never seen a similar shrillness to the conversation as I'm seeing now. And I feel that it's potentially very dangerous. So for me, taking forward what Henry has said, in 2024, I think we will need very cool heads and possibly also warm hearts, because we are sharing a humanity after all. Elections in the US, obviously a source of great unease in terms of who will be elected, but also elections in the European Parliament, so that's for us as well. First point. Second point, I do believe that think tanks should be honest, and I appreciate very much what our colleagues have done today. But I think also we were asked to be innovative. So I'm going to try and be a little bit innovative in three seconds. So first of all, to my Chinese friends who I respect and hold very dear, we can hold several thoughts at the same time. We're often told, don't be binary. And there is, we can hold 2, 3 thoughts. So we can cooperate, we do compete, and we can be rivals. So that is not contradictory. We can do those things together. Fourth point, you know, Francoise, you often say climate change, yes, but what? So my suggestion is loss and reparation, climate justice. The Global South has been asking for it at the last COP meeting and the coming one as well. Let's do it. It's a real devastating crisis for many countries in the Global South. The SDGs, we talked about it yesterday, source of inequality, let's do something about it. China has the funding and the know-how to do that, as well as the European Union. And finally, connectivity. I'm sorry, this is something I've been saying for several years now. Why are we competing on this? Why are our egos getting in the way of reality, where a number of African countries, Asian countries, need connectivity, and yet we're working in very different silos. So innovative, yes, please, and let's look ahead. It's going to be tough in 2024, but once again, with cool heads and warm hearts, I think we can get something really important done. Thank you.
Thank you, Shada. I'll give the floor now to Mr. Wang.
I think the Chinese side need to understand more about the Europeans' very emotional and strong reactions to Ukraine. Because for the Chinese in the past 45 years, there was no war in China and in China's neighbors. So the Chinese, you know, they live in a very peaceful environment. They don't understand that the Europeans actually suffered so many wars, from the Kosovo War, Georgia War, and then Ukraine War, and even maybe now conflicts, you know, neighbor, the refugees. And then the European Union also is, we say, is built on the values and on the World War II, and it's a legal rule of law. So the Chinese need to understand this, that the European Union is so sensitive. Basically, the Ukraine war also challenges the Westphalia system based on the sovereignty, territorial integrity. So I think maybe that's the reason we need to understand each other, the Chinese side, not just defend the policy on the relations with Russia. But frankly, the European side also need to understand that China never support Russians' behavior in Ukraine. That's the reason we never recognized the 4 states in Ukraine was a part of the Russians' territory. Even we didn't recognize the Crimea as a part of the Russians' territory. So that's, we have good relations with Russia. It's not for other purposes. It's not just support any behaviors that Russia did to you. So that's be distinguished. But one quick question for you, the panelists from Europe. Recently, the ECFR, European Council for the Foreign Affairs, released a proposal, or so-called the strategic independence. What's these relations with the strategic independence with the middle powers, with the relations with the de-risk from China? And then this independence also maybe causes a new risk from the middle powers. And also, what's the relations with strategic autonomy for the European Union? So I do not think you pay attention to the ECFR report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will go now to my left to Mrs. Jingling. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I will only have a very short comment. Start with Janka's point that the so-called partner, competitor, and rivalry come from the business community. I'm here to share with you my observations. Actually, the business community don't share the same view as regards to China-EU cooperation, definitely. In last month, when I visited Germany and France and Brussels, actually, especially I hold talks with BDI, the DIHK. I think all of these institutions represent the business communities, but their views are actually so different. So why, my question is why the BDI's narrative has had the upper hand? This is my question, and also very similar perception this time during my visit. I talked with a lot of think tanks working on economic issues. They shared with us the so fierce internal debate as regards to de-risking and also as regards to EU industrial policy. So it seems to me that it's far from a kind of consensus there. So my point is when we talk a lot about a balance relationship, my point is whether in next year, the debate as regards to China-EU relations should also be balanced, since we have witnessed how it has been dangerously slipping into the so-called competition and even rivalry dimension.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to Bruno, please. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bruno Libaber du CER, Center on Regulation in Europe. When we talk about international relations, we talk about strategy, strategic positioning, we talk about values, we talk about economic interest. But what is also equally important is perceptions, and perceptions matter. Yesterday, we heard a colleague from Hong Kong University saying that he was surprised that the American researchers who come to Hong Kong are being advised to come with empty computers and burner phones. So I think that it's very, very important that to understand that if there is distrust in the fact that the integrity of the electronic communications will be respected, this is not something which is conducive to trust. This is not conducive to the fact that we can work together. So I think this is something that we need to add, and the story of the visa, which was not available to one member of my colleagues from EPC, is another element which is absolutely not positive. I think that to move ahead, we need, as was already said, to focus on concrete actions on climate, but perhaps also on one area which has not been mentioned, and which is the digital area. It's clear that norms and standards are being discussed on artificial intelligence, on data, trusted flows of data transfer. These issues, resilience of digital infrastructures. Norms and standards are being discussed at world level for the moment. I think that there is a necessity, urgent necessity, that we can talk to each other and work together in the international areas, in the International Telecommunications Union, in the other UN fora, OECD, etc., G7, G20. This is something where we are really creating the infrastructure for understanding each other in the years to come. These norms and standards are not technical issues for experts. They are fundamental basis for a fruitful dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. I go to the Ambassador of Luxembourg. Please, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for inviting us. It's my first time. I've arrived only a couple of weeks ago. My first time to participate in such an interesting exchange. I would like to pick up where my predecessor just left it, so to focus really on concrete cooperation. You mentioned digital transition, which I had on my list as well. I see a few other areas, and I would like to put it a bit more concrete than just talking about climate change. But I see in this country and also in Europe, I think we have still a long way to go when it comes to improving our energy efficiency standards. I think there's a lot to be done. Circular economy, there are some interesting experiences in this country, but we also have some in Europe where maybe we could get the engineers to working together and develop common projects and also reach common standards. Then last but not least, green finance. I know that there is cooperation on a common taxonomy on green finance, and I hear there are some positive developments. I think that's another very important area in order to help us finance the green transition that we aiming at as well in China and in the EU. And then last but not least, maybe a question nonetheless. Mrs. Shada Islam already referred to it. We will have in 2024 elections, European Parliament elections. We may be getting a new commission. So how do scholars and colleagues, how do you see potential impacts of that on the EU-China relations, although obviously it's very difficult in knowing how this is going to come out? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll go to Michael on this side. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
It's working? Okay. Thank you. This question is for Janka and Francoise. I hope Ricardo and Henry will give them 1 minute to answer. You come from very famous think tanks, European Council and IFRI. I noticed when we all talk about having a list of grievances or a list of issues where we can be innovative and constructive, it sounds like we are all deliberately leaving out strategic nuclear issues. Colin Bradford yesterday mentioned a space code of conduct. Usually the idea is to avoid arms race in space, which has already started. It's to have stability and exchange. In the nuclear weapons area, both IFRI and European Council have sometimes addressed the issue. So my question really is it a good idea when we have EU-China think tank exchanges? Should we exclude all security issues? Should we exclude Ukrainian victimization by Russian aggression? Should we exclude space race? Should we exclude China's new military and nuclear buildup? Our military now is talking about strategic nuclear breakout by China, going to double or triple the number of nuclear weapons. China now has more ICBM silos. Silo, by the way, if you're a Chinese language student, is called Fa She Jing. So in the Cold War, if the Soviets or the Americans had a huge strategic breakout, this would be a matter of negotiation, a matter of think tanks looking into it, looking for fresh ideas. So Henry, are we intentionally ruling out Ukraine or security issues, or should great think tanks like IFRI and European Council of Foreign Relations also include this in their thinking? Because I think there's a real need for innovation in these areas. But I don't want to violate any rules about the Shirley Fanway and the division of labor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Mr. Hans Dorville, please.
Thank you very much. Let me also thank CCG and the organizers of this forum for a very appropriate discussion, which is stimulating. And what Shada Islam said, she was shocked by the shrillness of the debate this morning. I only can endorse that, because being a European, I was listening to the EU ambassador, and I couldn't imagine that this would be really a common line of all 27 member states of the EU. Even in one country, my own country, Germany, you have the differences between the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary. So they're speaking different, or they're singing different tunes vis-a-vis China. So this is a little bit complex, but what Bruno Liebherberg said, that we need a stronger element in talking to each other in a regular manner and in a more civilized manner, I think is very important for the multilateralism. It's not only the UN and the UN principles which come out in the Ukraine, but it is also recently when the United States joined UNESCO, or rejoined UNESCO again, they said they go there in order to control or to suppress the influence of China. Now, if you're going to a multilateral organization, you better cooperate rather than control and suppress. So these are the difficulties which we are facing these days, and I think one has to reflect a little bit stronger how that can be brought to a much better and much more direct relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wang, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks to the CCG organizers for providing us, to the scholars, ambassadors, and all the policymakers, this platform to communicate with each other the sincere views on EU-China relations. I just have a follow-up question to the His Excellency Ryland just raised about next year's election in the European side. As far as from my personal observation, I find possibly when we look at the EU-China relations in the next year, we could not overlook the political shifts and the political forces changes within the EU itself. It's a little bit concern. It seems like the right-wing political force are gaining a momentum in the EU side. And I have a question to the panelists. Would this affect the next year's EU-China relations? How do you view the right-wing forces, voices are becoming more and more stronger in the EU, within the EU? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you and to all those that contributed for your questions. I will now give the floor to the speakers in reverse order so they can address some of the questions were very direct to people. Others were sort of more reflections. So I would invite our speakers to reflect on the points that they will find that they can contribute or they want to contribute. But I'll do it in reverse order. So Mr. Dai Changzheng, you have the floor. If you, yeah.
Yeah, I agree some points of view of our speakers. First of all, I should say that, yeah, we need dialogue, we need communication. However, the situation, we just, you know, wish, you know, positive, optimistic future of the China-US Europe relations. However, we need, most importantly, create chances, create, you know, to have more practical ways to change such a situation. That is the most important. And I just say that we have, from my point of view, there are some contradictory elements in the policies. And you see, European side, just another concept is the strategic autonomy. What does this mean? If it means that it should keep a strategic autonomy with both China and the US, that is okay. If the strategic autonomy just towards China, just attack very different stance, different attitude and practices toward United States and China. Now, how can the China side, what does the China side will think? So we should keep concept, theories, policies actually cohesive with our practice, with our policy. If our concept, our acclamation, our assertion is not getting cohesive with our practices, then how do people think of your policy, of the logic? So it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francoise, we have the floor, please.
Well, thank you. So very quick points. First of all, about the elections, well, I would tend to challenge the idea that the right is gaining ground in Europe. It's not all that obvious. The recent election in Poland proved exactly the opposite. So, elections are elections. The results are not known in advance. So we'll see what happens. You can never tell. And so it's extremely complicated to anticipate what the results will be, and as a result, what the next commission will look like. So I think it's extremely complicated to do such a thing. Second, about strategic autonomy. Well, I'm pretty comfortable trying to explain what it is, since originally it was a French concept. And I think it was a very unclear concept, which was interpreted in very different ways throughout Europe, even throughout France. And as you will have noticed, perhaps, President Macron is now using less and less the strategic autonomy concept and has shifted towards sovereignty. And I think it perhaps describes much better what he had in mind. Strategic autonomy was about the ability to define your own interests, your interest on your own, and not to simply align with the US. That was the point. So it's more about sovereignty than anything else, but it was, I guess, badly understood everywhere, and as well as in China, including China. And this is really a problem with a number of concepts. Same thing is about de-risking. De-risking is badly understood. De-risking is not about China. It is about reducing vulnerabilities associated with excessive dependence. So it happens that, China is one of the economy on which the EU depends a lot for a number of products, but it's not about, China specifically. It's really about, limiting, reducing dependence. But I think it's badly understood. And same thing is true for the Holy Trinity. I think Shada explained very well that we can do many things at the same time, 3 things at the same time. And so there is absolutely no contradiction behind this Holy Trinity of rival, systemic rival, partner and competitor. But again, this is something that is badly understood. So I guess we require a lot of pedagogy to explain exactly what we have in mind. And this is something sometimes very, very complicated. Well, I leave the tricky question about nuclear to Janka, because I'm simply a modest economist, so nuclear stuff is not my stuff. And finally, thanks for the concrete proposals about what can be done between the EU and China on climate finance, energy efficiency, circular economy, etc., etc. With regards to data governance, I agree that this is a really big issue. And I agree that the discussion about norms and standards with regards to data governance is also of utmost importance. But as I said yesterday, but perhaps some of you didn't attend the session yesterday, this is a tricky issue again, because the philosophies underlying data governance in various parts of the world are very different. And so, there needs to be a discussion, but to get to a common ground will be, I guess, complicated. But let's discuss.
Thank you, Francoise. I turn now to Mrs. Sun Yongfu. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think we have a very frank discussion. This is helpful. to our bilateral relations, not only in the political arena, but also the economic and trade relations. I share the view of our German friends that saying that, either China or any country join the UN agencies, they would like to cooperate, not to, to dispute. To my understanding, and as our ambassador, Mr. Wu Hailong mentioned, the system difference is there for a long time. And we don't understand why now the EU put systemic rival at the first place. And from the Chinese point of view, we put EU firstly as our partner, cooperative partner. So we try very much, together with our friends from the EU, where we can cooperate. The different sectors we can cooperate, not only in the green economy, for example, but also the international challengers, some other field as well. So we need to cooperate more and enlarge that sectors as we discussed today, but not to heavily mention the so-called rivals. We have never put the EU as our rival. So we don't understand why now, and put China in the systemic rival at the first place and put emphasis on that from time to time. So this is very difficult for us to understand. We try to cooperate, we try to find a way to enlarge our cooperation, but to close, the differences between us is difficult. We put everything on the table as we do it today to discuss the differences, but to enlarge the field of cooperation. I think that's a way to, to look forward as we discuss today, the year of, 2024 or even beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Janka, you have the floor.
Thank you. So maybe first on the question of Wang on strategic interdependence and what the concept is supposed to mean, I think we'll be in the category of Francoise of saying it is an attempt to describe the world that we see from a European perspective, a world in which countries do not want to be squeezed into a bipolar order and don't want to choose, and where the strengths of certain middle powers could lie in kind of banding together and creating kind of flexible coalitions around issue-specific areas. Whether this concept of strategic interdependence will take hold as a real concept, I'm very skeptical, let's put it like that. On the question of Wang in terms of the question of the European Parliament, I do think it's really interesting to look into, just from a research perspective, what are far right and far left positions on China across Europe, because there's no uniform answer to that. There are far-right parties in Europe that are very pro-Chinese. There are far-right parties in China, in Europe, that are very kind of, very skeptical of China. And I think it is a really good research area at the moment to look into, also from a European perspective, to kind of do a little mapping of where do far-right and far-left parties stand when it comes to China, because that does have, if the fringes are stronger in the European Parliament, this obviously does have an impact on policy formulation. On the question of Jinping, I would say the need to de-risk is the consensus. The how is not the consensus. Welcome to Europe. On these questions we can discuss, we will discuss for years. And obviously there's no consensus among the German business community because the business community has various different interests. But the fact that the BDI paper is still being referred to, also by companies, also tells you that this is sort of the minimal consensus that they can still agree on, because they could overturn it if they wanted to, but they don't. So this is still the position where the companies feel comfortable having the business associations taking that role and basically taking the hit also also for a slightly harder position, and being able to kind of hide behind it as an individual company. And Michael, I couldn't agree more that the security issues belong on the table in these conversations. I think this is the only point where I maybe slightly disagree with Francoise, that I think the fact that Europe does not see China as a kind of existential threat, I do think that that is moving, that this is changing because the situation in Russia is bringing the security questions, the situation in Ukraine is bringing the security questions much closer home, and we're now having in the German-China strategy a real kind of passage on China as a security challenge, and I think that's something that is very new for the European conversation and emerging, and space conversations and nuclear conversations belong at the heart of that. That is absolutely true. This is a new version of EU-China relations, I think one we have to get used to.
Thank you, Janka. Kui, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Because of the time is tight, so I'm sorry that we couldn't have time to expand our discussion. But I need to try to, share some 3 points as I heard so much from my colleagues here. Firstly, regarding to the so-called trade balance issue, especially raised from Madam Nicolas Francoise. Francoise is a very, very close friend of mine and also a respected economist. So I believe that you do have a very professional analysis about this difficult issue now between China and the European Union on the trade imbalance. But I also would like to say that behind all of this explanation or analysis from the European Union side on this anti-subsidy investigation or some other trade verifications between China and the European Union, I also would like to mention the, as we know, very, very big ambition from the European Union institution, try to show off its authority as one of the, dominating policy-making institution, and try to practice any kind of even over-regulation against China. Another also mention we will not mention is how about this, as we know, the European Union side try to look for a more comfortable position between this, as we know, gaming between China, US, and the European Union. As we know, because there is still the trade surplus between European Union and the United States, but at the same time, European Union is suffering from this, subsidy competition from Washington. So I think between China and the United States, certainly to choose China as a target of this anti-subsidy investigation will be more comfortable or more favorable for European Union. But according to my observation, that maybe for long term, no matter what happened between Washington and Brussels, no matter how close cooperation, coordination between European Union and the United States, I think still a constructive competition, not only in green economy, in subsidies, some other sectors, will give some more risks for European Union, try to, insist its green economy industry policy. Secondly, how about this Ukrainian issue? I don't want to say something more because it looks like China always is defending itself. It looks like China did something wrong once it insists its current position or attitude. I just want to say that maybe from Chinese perspective, once China agree with any kind of requirement from European Union side, especially to share some moral, stance with European Union on Russia, certainly there will be another more requirement from European Union side. For example, European Union side will require China to join into the sanctions against Moscow. And also, European Union side will require China maybe do something similar with the European Union to drop down or to reduce its economic and trade relations with Russia. All of this requirement, I don't think is in the interest of China. I think another very big concern from China is once something did in that way, once something done in that way, what's the benefits for China to get some more, cooperation from European Union or even from United States? Now, I think it's just a very, very big dilemma from this requirement from European Union on China is, so please join me to have some more, condemns or criticisms, even sanctions against Moscow. But of course, at the same time, you need to do something to have some more influence on Moscow. So I think it's a conflicting requirement from European Union. Because once China takes the side of European Union on this Ukrainian crisis, I don't think there will be more space for China to impose influence on Moscow. And also finally, yes, now we are talking about any kind of possibility for the China-EU relations, especially in the next year. Why? Because next year there will be some, political changes happen, not only in Washington and in Brussels or maybe in some other capitals of European countries. I think that no matter what happens, once European Union side just take the approach to deal with all of this crisis and to try to reach resilience, just like President von der Leyen mentioned that European Union needs to go back to future. Of course, go back to the future means that there will be maybe a big cycle or bigger range we need to cover or we need to reach. So unfortunately, the China-EU relations will be part of this approach of go back to the future from the European Union. So, but I think we are still, confident about this future. Even we are more patient, even we have some more resilience. But of course, I think now the very big risk for European Union side is go back to the future. The future would be the destination. But perhaps once European Union or some other players make some big mistakes, perhaps we will just go back to the past, not to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kui. Fabian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm the last person standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to be very quick. So I'll make very short points, but very happy to also continue that discussion over lunch. First point I want to make, that Henry mentioned the condemnation of nuclear war. And I think it's important to say that this is extremely welcome, and I think it is something which needs to continue to happen, that it has to be clear that this cannot be an option in the war of Russia against Ukraine. Second point, it is difficult to cooperate on climate change because it's intricately linked to industrial policy, to trade, to all of the issues. I mean, this is exactly what we had with electrical vehicles. Is it a climate change issue? Is it a trade issue? And I think that points towards actually more global conversations. We need to have an agreement on what constitutes relevant and effective action to promote climate change and what is protectionism in that context. Third point, I think sometimes the strong reactions to what happens in Europe by China can then make the situation worse. The comprehensive agreement on investment was mentioned. I cannot see a future for the comprehensive agreement on investment as long as there are sanctions on members of the European Parliament. So these kind of reactions and counter-reactions hinder the relationship. Fourth point on the new political cycle, I think, yes, there might be change, but the same pressures and challenges remain. And while there is a diversity of opinion in Europe, I would actually argue that there's a fairly broad consensus on some of the key questions, on some of the key priorities. And sometimes I worry that some of the voices you hear in China are not very representative of that consensus. And I think that's why it's important to have these exchanges. And my final point, and this is a bit of a personal point as well, please feel free to criticize the EU, criticize what we are saying. But when I say something that my Chinese colleagues don't like, then please don't portray it as somehow coerced by the US. The EU has its own opinion, I have my own opinions, we do not speak for the US. We have a lot of disagreements also with the US, so please engage with us on an EU perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian. It remains to me to thank all the participants, all the speakers. I think we have a lot of food for thought, also for the next iterations of this dialogue to continue the conversation. And the conversation will also continue in the afternoon. But I think now it's time, after the food for thought, now to actual food and to have a lunch break. And so enjoy your break. I think we resume at 2 o'clock. Yes, at 2 o'clock we resume. So thank you very much again. And thank you to all the speakers. Thanks.